So, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Paul, for taking the time to have this interview with me. It is a huge pleasure for me to be talking to you. And in Brazil, we are really excited to have you here with us. As I've mentioned for you previously, we have over 1,000 attendees already confirmed, and I know that a lot of them are really excited to see you and to learn from you. So my first question to you is, how did you get involved with schema therapy? How was the process to get involved with schema therapy?
Well, first of all, Leonardo, I just want to express my gratitude of being invited, because I've been longing to see your country for a very long time. Because when I grew up, I was watching your soccer team, and
Yeah.
so as a kid, it was Socrates and all these. It was amazing. So thank you for that. Then how I got into schema therapy? Well, it's a big question, but to give you some sense of what drew me to schema therapy is that in Sweden, I'm a director of an institute that gives psychotherapy training. And in Sweden, we have, in order to be a psychotherapist, you need to go to a licensing program. So it's a 4.5 years program. It's not full-time training, but 4.5 years. And it was an institute that was established by my parents in the 80s. And my parents, they were introducing CBT to Sweden. And my father was a colleague with Dr. Beck in Philadelphia. And when I grew up, psychotherapy was something within my family, although I had a lot of other interests and so on. But when I completed medical school and when I completed my psychotherapy training, and because I wanted to do psychotherapy, then my father died. It was now over 20 years ago. And then I was asked if I could take on the role of directing the institute we had. It was a little premature in terms that I was fairly young at that time, but I knew that I wanted to continue with teaching in psychotherapy and do therapy myself. And when you run a training, like a huge training center or institute, you need to have some vision on what kind of training do you want to give, and what do you sense is helpful for people. And I'm always been interested, my own sort of interest is helping people connect, because the thing that has been important for me in my own life is to have a sense that there is someone who knows me and who I can connect with and who I can share, so that I will be less alone in the world, in a sense. So that was something important. And I had read some of Jeff Young's early writings. And at that time, back late 90s, he only had that thin book called, what was it? Schema-focused cognitive therapy for personality disorders, or something like that. And my mother in the 80s, in the early 80s, had been to training at Beck's Institute, and she had met Jeff when he was younger then, and he was a young person at Beck's Institute. And she had always been talking about Jeff, that she thought he had some really interesting sort of developments in the field of therapy. So I contacted Jeff, and we met, and I invited him to Sweden, and soon we became, friends, personal friends, but also he helped me in terms of how could I how could I establish a training that was building on the philosophy of treatment that I had, which was very much tied to his then chemotherapy. So then I was trained by Jeff, and he supervised me. And as things evolved, we started to have a lot of collaborations, and we started to discussing together with some other colleagues that we should form some kind of organization or something. And then in the early 2000, I think it was 2005 or six, we had the first meeting in Stockholm to see if we could start up some kind of association. Uh, and then led to that in 2008, we established ISST, which now is our Schemotherapy Society. So my way into schemotherapy was built on a need to find something that I believed in terms of treatment that was not only focused on reducing symptoms or changing behaviors per se, but also some deep emotional change, and also that had some developmental theory within the model. So Jeff's model that focused on core needs fit the need I had in terms of finding some therapeutic approach. Yeah.
That's great. That's great to hear. In a lot of ways, I have a lot of similarities. What you were saying, both my parents are also therapists. My father was one that was one of the people who brought CBT to Brazil. So in a way, I felt really connected to what you were saying, and it really meant a lot to me. So thank you for that. In a way, it made me feel really good. So it was really nice to hear that from you as well. I didn't know that, so it was really, really nice. And Paul, moving on to a different question, we know that you have a focus on working with couples as well in chemotherapy. So I would like to ask you, what are the main difference, and how do you see the difference between working with couples with chemotherapy and other approaches like CBT or any other approach that you might have encountered in your time practicing?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, since chemotherapy, although if we start off, if you work in chemotherapy for individual therapy, it's still a relational sort of approach, because we have the limited reparenting part. So a lot about chemotherapy is helping people establish sustainable, close, intimate relationships. So within the original model, it is already focused on understanding interpersonal relations, right? And if you look at chemotherapy for couples compared to CBT or emotion-focused couples therapy and so on, I would say that, and this is my understanding though, that I think that an approach like emotion-focused couples therapy, which is it's a effective and a good couples therapy approach, have quite a few similarities with the interventions and so on that we do in chemotherapy. But what we have that I think is a difference is the mode model and the mode concept. And when working with a couple, it's very helpful to have the concept of mode, so you can see that you have coping modes that might clash and collide. There are needy parts behind that. We have the sort of what we call the child modes and so on. And we have internalized parent modes and so on. So we could see in a dynamic with the couple, it's might be wrong to say easy, but it's easier when you can organize what's happening and see the broader picture. And for instance, in some CBT approaches, not all of them, you're more focused on sort of, since it's more task oriented and it's more focused on sort of problem solving, we don't get too caught in the problem solving, more to see what is it behind the problem that is driving it. So the concept of schemas, which beneath the schema, it's an unmet need. And if we have an approach to help people, a couple, see sort of behind what's presented and understand that there is a part behind there that might be scared, might be angry or frustrated. And it's when you acknowledge that and when you validate that, it's so much more effective than to be caught in debating who picks up the children from school, how many times did you do that? And a traditional CBT task could be, well, could you make a list until next time, how many times do you pick up the kids and so on. And you get into things that are not the core issues.
Okay.
So that's basically what I would be the immediate impression that.
Oh, that's great. I think I believe that everyone will understand and will have a grasp of what you're saying, and I know that you'll get way more in depth of that in the conference, and you'll be able to talk a little bit more about schema therapy for couples. And I know that there are a lot of people here in Brazil who are excited about it and want to hear from you to talk about schema therapy for couples. And let me ask you a little bit of a different question. You've mentioned that you provide trainings and you were also a psychotherapist. So what are your main focus when in the psychotherapy world? Like, is it teaching? Is it supervision? Is it clinical practice? Is a mix of all of that?
Well, it's a good question, but for me in my life, personally, it's so important to do all these things, because when I meet clients, it's you've been trained, the model, you have internalized sort of the theory and so on, but then you just leave that and you're with the client and you try. I mean, in the best of worlds, that's what you aim to do, right? I wouldn't say we all strive to do our best, right? But in order to, that's one kind. I mean, if you take the analogy of being a carpenter, you need to have different skills, right? If you're building a house, you need one person to know how to build the foundation, or then one person to draw the map for the house, right? You might need someone to make the chimney, So you need different skills, and it's one thing to be a clinician, but if you want to build your skills on understanding and have a conceptual understanding, teaching is very good, because when you teach someone else, you are sort of forced to formulate what maybe more implicitly, and be able to put words to it. So doing the teaching part is helping me become more aware of things in the clinical world. But I wouldn't feel like I was a good teacher if I didn't do the clinical work, because you need to know that what you're teaching about, how it really plays out in the clinical room, right? And then when it comes to research, for instance, it's important to also know that if I say like this, to me, schema therapy is a very helpful model for helping people, but I don't see it as the only answer to psychotherapy. We need to have an open mind that there are other therapy approaches that we need to be curious about, and so on. So when we go into more of a research mode, we need to look at our own model with more critical eyes and see, okay, when I'm in the therapy room, I believe in it and I do it. But when I'm in the research, I need to sort of question what I think I know and say, do I have sort of empirical support for that, in order to elaborate on the model and develop the model and come up with maybe more new theoretical concepts that might be missing and needed, but also new intervention that will increase the efficiency of the approach and so on. I sort of split between clinic, teaching, and some research.
Getting back to it, it makes total sense. Is when you said the split, what came to my mind was like a little bit of a mode dialogue. Like, okay, now it's the research mode, the clinician mode, and how all of that integrates in one being, and that being you. It makes total sense, and I really like your saying about to be aware of other psychotherapy approaches, because I believe that that's the main goal for us as clinicians, is to understand what goes around with our patient and see what will work best for that individual. And for that, we need to be aware of what's going on outside chemotherapy as well. So it was really nice to hear that from you, Poul. And Poul, my last and final question to you, it's more of an open question, but what are your expectations for the conference here in Brazil, and what are your expectations for coming to Brazil as well?
Oh, as I started off saying in the beginning of our talk, is that Brazil has been sort of, it is to me, I never been there, but it's always been an amazing country, and it's always, at least in Sweden, apart from some politics and so on, it's portrayed as there's so you have the carnivals and all these things. But my expectations is to meet clinicians in your part of the world and to interact, hopefully, and learn from you sort of what are you in terms of chemotherapy and psychotherapy, what are your main sort of themes that you are discussing in Brazil in terms of therapy? Because I'm really, psychotherapy is is both a job, but it's also an interest. It's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So, and I really look forward meeting you and your father and other people in Brazil, and the audience to interact and receive questions and try to answer and all these things. It's
and I'm sure that everyone here will be really excited to talk to you, to interact with you. And you mentioned soccer, football, like we say here, and if you want to, we can watch some football games here as well. It's not as great as it was with Socrates and the other players, but it's something. So if it is of your interest, we can. I'm sure that we can organize that as well.
But bottom line, I'm really honored and feel privileged to be invited.
It is our honor to have you here with us, Poul, and we are really, really excited to have you. And we are counting the days. It is getting closer and closer, so people are also getting excited about the conference and to get back to the live in-person conference. That is something that we are all missing, and it is a huge part of our lives as clinicians, researchers, and teachers as well.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for the interview, for the time, Poul. I'm sure that people will try to get in touch with you in the conference, and will be a really nice time together.
Yeah, thank you.